Hello, today we're going to look at the bleeding phase of the menstrual cycle. So the bleeding phase of the menstrual cycle, I'm actually going to consider what initiates this phase. So in my chart, I include the few days before we actually start bleeding, because this is when our body actually makes the changes. So that's about the last week of the luteal cycle. And then I'll talk about bleeding. And in terms of thinking about the bigger patterns that are happening, it's an opportunity to release what we no longer need, and we can start anew. So looking at our bleeding, how do you relate to this phase of the menstrual cycle? Do you welcome the changes that lead to losing blood? How do you see the blood? And also I'd like you to reflect on how perhaps the way that you bleed has changed over your life. Giving a little bit of a personal history, it was actually partly having a lot of pain when I was bleeding that led me into wanting to study more about my body and more about shiatsu. And my early periods in my 20s and in adolescence were extremely heavy and uncomfortable. And I know that this is the case for a lot of adolescents because it's the first time that we release. It's a beginning of a whole new cycle in our lives. So it's not surprising that for many of us, the early years of our cycle can be quite challenging and quite difficult. And mine certainly were. And also, I don't think it particularly helped that my mother called the menstruation the curse. Many women of her generation saw it as a curse. So I think it's slightly not surprising that I experienced it as something not very pleasant. Many of the taboos around bleeding have been broken, but maybe some people have gone too much the other way and see it as a complete inconvenience and something even to suppress. Certainly for me in my life, partly I think because of all the work that I did on myself, but I think also through having children. For me, having children was a big clearing out, and that changed many of my patterns of menstruation. But I know that for some people, giving birth can create more blocks in our womb, and that periods can become more painful after having children. And again, as we get older, for some of us, going through the perimenopause can be quite challenging, and sometimes bleeding becomes more painful at that time of our life. For me, I feel I had my painful periods early on in my life, and the menstruation was a liberation and a lightening. The menopause was a liberation and a lightening. So we all have different experience and relationships to our period depending on the different phases of our life, and that's quite a normal thing. And so much so that modern medicine has seen looking at our menstrual cycle as being one of the vital signs of our health. And certainly that's how the ancient Chinese viewed the menstrual cycle, looking at the length of it, looking at how we bleed. That it's all really helpful information for us about the state of our being. It's a monthly check-in, as it were, to see where we're at in our lives and how we've been doing in the last month. So I want to explain a little bit about what's physiologically happening, what starts this release. And this is why I actually have chosen to include the last few days of the luteal cycle. So if you haven't seen the video on the luteal phase and the corpus luteum, do go over and watch that one to understand more about the corpus luteum and what its role is. But basically, after about a week after ovulation, if there is no fertilized egg that arrives in our womb, then no signals are sent back for the corpus luteum to continue. Remember that the corpus luteum was producing progesterone, estrogen and relaxin, so the levels of these hormones were high. But once the corpus luteum starts to die, the levels drop quite quickly, and so there's a fairly abrupt hormonal change that happens around about 10 days after ovulation. You can see it on the chart. Progesterone and estrogen levels drop quite significantly, and the dropping of these levels of hormones actually starts to reduce the thickness of the lining of the womb. We're making a nest, as you remember in the previous video, and now there's no creation that's coming to be nourished and nurtured in the nest, so our body needs to clear out the nest. So with the drop of progesterone and estrogen, that causes tissue in the lining of our womb, in our endometrium, to start to die. So tissue dies, the lining constricts, it starts to reduce, as you can also, that's also shown in the chart. And it's this lining dying and the change in hormones that actually tells the body to eventually release the blood through menstruation. I think it's important to see that bit before, because also menstruation, I've talked as also in the other phases how they relate to other phases of our life and how they can prepare us for other phases of our life. So menstruation is preparing us for eventually, if we do give birth, for giving birth. And so the tissue dying, the hormones dropping, start to cause our womb to contract, which is what it's also going to do when we give birth. And the womb contracting then allows the tissue, the dying tissue, to be released, and that's menstruation. And menstruation itself varies quite a lot in length from woman to woman, but also from cycle to cycle. As I said, it's a check of what's happened in our previous month and what's going on in our life. So that can vary quite a lot, probably from about 4 to 6. Sometimes women bleed for longer. I'm just going to go back to a bit how we might feel in the week or so before we actually start to bleed, as we're preparing for releasing, because women can feel quite differently, woman to woman, or at different phases of our life. So if we think about what was happening in the luteal phase, our energy was building to make the nest. But for some of us, our energies stay fairly weak through the cycle. Maybe we've had a month or a period of time in our lives when we're quite exhausted, when we're quite depleted, and so we feel quite low and flat in energy. And this means that everything is a bit more sluggish. We don't get this sort of surge to then release the blood. Everything's a bit slow and flat. For others of us, if the energy has built up, then it's a sudden shift, and this sudden shift of the changes in hormones we each respond to differently. So if our energy is quite strong, in Chinese medicine we talk about a surge of yang energy, a strong movement, because it's a movement. Yang, if you remember from the overview video, yang is a movement of energy outwards. It's a strong movement, it's the sun rising, it's also spring. Some of you relate to the different seasons, and we talked about the seasons in previous videos. This surge of energy coming out of winter, when everything starts to awaken and shoots come through the earth, come through the ground, everything's a bit more outward. And this is really the energy of birth, but this is the energy that we can experience every month through our blood loss, this surge, a yang movement out. This yang movement out in terms of the seasons is spring. So if our energies have built, we have a strong spring energy movement, a movement outwards. For many women, this can be a time of creativity. It's another moment of creation. We have also a similar surge of energy outwards at ovulation, but it's an inner surge. But at menstruation, it's preparing for an outer surge. So often women feel quite creative, they want to connect with other people. Some women feel quite sexual at this time. And actually having sex and having an orgasm can often be quite helpful for this clearing out and help to ease pain and help the energies to flow outwards, as also during birth. Some women find that having sex before giving birth helps with that relaxation and letting go. We get a surge of endorphins and it can help the whole experience be quite pleasant and letting go and creative. Whereas not everybody feels like that. Some women may feel that their energy gets a bit stuck. So this is when there's a blockage, when our energy, for whatever reason, maybe can't release. So what could be the reasons why we might have blockages? It could be more of an emotional blockage, an emotion that we're not able to express. And the emotion that goes with this yang movement, and the strongest emotion for the yang expressing outwards, is joy and creativity. Now, if that's blocked, it's like a plant wanting to come through the earth and it is getting pushed back down, and so there's lots of irritation and frustration, a strong energy that wants to release, but you're holding it in. Then the whole body can get quite contracted, quite tense, but also emotionally quite frustrated. So there can be anger, and that's a lot of what are often described as typical PMS symptoms, premenstrual symptoms. In Chinese terms, that's wood energy being held in, emotions that can't be expressed. It could also be more physical blockages. I have my little model of the pelvis. All this change is happening within our pelvic area. Our womb is below the pubic bone, but it's part of this whole area in our body. It's protected by the pelvis, and there's a very powerful vessel in Chinese medicine called the Girdle Vessel, which basically contains, wrapping everything around. It relates to the womb and also our kidneys in Chinese medicine, which are more in our lower back, not where our physical kidneys are. But interestingly, that's where our physical kidneys started their life, lower down. And in fact, our kidneys are very related to our womb. Anyway, there's more videos on the importance of kidneys in Chinese medicine and the womb, the reproductive organs. But for now, just be aware that there's like a girdle wrapped around our whole pelvic area. The top part is our ribs, the bottom part is our lower back. And because so many of us spend so much time sitting, then often we can get a lot of tightness and sluggishness within this whole area. And also, many people don't eat foods that they can digest fully and properly, or they're carrying a lot of extra weight around the girdle area. And so it could be a more dietary related blockage, that we're very bloated, we've not been eating good foods. Often people do get desires, cravings around this time. And if they're eating a lot of food that isn't particularly helpful for them, like lots of sugary things or lots of processed food, then it's actually potentially creating more blockages. And so towards the end of this video, I'm actually going to give you a few simple movements that help to move and get the energies flowing in this girdle vessel on a physical level if we're sitting a lot, but also can help with the digestion and support flow through the digestive system, which could be blocking the flow of blood as well. If one thing is blocked in this area, everything can get blocked. So this is coming back to the girdle vessel. So the other reasons why there may be blockages can be lack of movement, but also poor diet. And if there's a blockage, that's where we might have difficulty moving into the next phase of letting go. So women can feel quite frustrated. Yes, and there can be blockages created as the corpus luteum dies. Sometimes it doesn't fully die or disintegrate, because remember, it was the corpus luteum was the follicle, the fluid-filled sac. And sometimes if our energies are blocked, the corpus luteum doesn't fully disintegrate and fluid remains in it. And this can take up to 3 cycles to release, and it can feel quite painful. And if it doesn't fully release, then you can get cysts on the ovaries. Another not so common response, but I do know quite a few women for whom this is the response, and it's also quite similar to when we give birth. Before giving birth, so giving birth to a baby, often women want to slow down, gather their energies, because there's a part of the body that knows that letting go of blood is taking up a lot of energy. It's also depleting our energy because we're losing blood. Blood is a form of energy as well as something physical within our body. And so some women find in this week before, their energy may have built and may be strong, but they just sense that they need to go inwards. It's also their response to the hormonal change. They just need to slow down, not do very much, take care of themselves, build up their energy, and then they're ready for menstruation. So now I'm going to look at what's actually happening in the days when we're bleeding.